Well, hello everybody. It is Monday, May 18th, 2020, and this is a big day for me personally because it's the anniversary of May 18th, 1980 when Mount St. Helens exploded. And I grew up in Portland, Oregon, spent that summer completely covered in ash, and it was a quite literal blast. The day the mountain exploded, it had been threatening for a while. My family was checking out a Renaissance fair at Reed College, and we could see the clouds of smoke and ash from the campus. And I bring it up partly because then, like now, was a time of a great deal of uncertainty, living with an active volcano at your doorstep. And there would be times when we couldn't go out because the world was covered in ash. If you tried to drive, it would ruin your car. If you tried to pick berries, they would be covered in ash. And then, as now, we all had to wear masks to go out, although the threat obviously was a little bit more visible. And back then, nobody ever politicized a volcano. Nobody ran around claiming that wearing masks was an infringement on their right to clog up their lungs. Oh, how times change. So anyway, here in Vermont, things are going pretty well for the last week or so. There have only been a couple of new COVID-19 cases a day, although cumulative over the weekend, there's about 8. Reminder that anyone without symptoms can now be tested at a pop-up location. And in particular, healthcare workers, first responders, childcare providers are encouraged to get tested. People who are returning to Vermont or visiting Vermont still need to quarantine for 14 days, but at day 7 or later in your quarantine period, you can also be tested. And if you have symptoms, definitely check with your primary care physician first. The Vermont Department of Health website also has guidance on small steps you can take now to start safely visiting with friends and family at healthvermont.gov. I've included it here. It's important, says our very intelligent state, to continue physical distancing when you leave home to prevent new cases from increasing quickly. They also recommend wearing cloth face masks or coverings as a habit when you leave. Just do it. And as a point of reference, the mask should cover your nose and your mouth, not your chin and not your neck, because your chin and your neck are not sources of viral transmission. And in the whole conversation about some people's resistance to wear masks, remember that you can not have symptoms and still be transmitting. And so covering your face helps you to protect others. So it's not about your own weakness if that's something you're worried about. This is about being a superhero and taking care of other folks. So be a mensch, wear a mask. Governor Scott extended Vermont's 2-month-old state of emergency to June 15th, but he's assured Vermonters that if infection rates continue to stay low, outdoor dining, close contact businesses like salons and other indoor businesses can open up by June 1st. He's also said that he'll expand the limit on gatherings, now set at 10, up to 25. And lodging operations, short-term rentals, campgrounds, and marinas can accept overnight reservations for stays after May 22nd for Vermont residents or for those who've met the 14-day quarantine requirement. One other thing before we get going on mental health, there's a movement to try to establish voting by mail, given that we don't know what the arc of things are going to be and what things are going to be like in November. And Vermont Secretary of State Jim Condas, Jim's a great guy, has a vote by mail plan that the governor has not yet signed on to. And there's a petition to Governor Scott written by VPIRG and endorsed by the ACLU of Vermont, Disability Rights Vermont, Justice for All, Main Street Alliance, Rights and Democracy Vermont, Vermont Climate and Health Alliance, Vermont Conservation Voters, Vermont Conservation Law Foundation, and Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility. If you want to sign that petition to the governor, it's at the VPIRG website, vpirg.org, also posted here. And on a national level, if you're a business leader, you can join hundreds of other business leaders signing a letter from Businesses for America to Congress in support of secure mail-in ballots and safe in-person voting sites for the 2020 election. So if you're a business leader, you can go to bfa.us/votesafe. So, mental health. Mark, hi, welcome. Mark Nash, husband and mental health counselor, though not my mental health counselor. So one of the things that's come up is as people have been staying home, been quarantined, been stuck, been lonely, been frustrated, been isolated, been scared, particularly in this community, a lot of folks have been smoking a lot of pot, probably more so than usual. So let's talk about addiction in general. Like, if someone's worried about their behavior, how would they know whether or not they're addicted?
Well, first of all, we should talk about the possibility of being addicted to cannabis at all. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, but my understanding from everything that I've read is that it is highly unlikely, if not impossible, to become physiologically addicted to cannabis in the same way that we are, where it's possible to be addicted to alcohol, to opioids.
Caffeine?
Well, caffeine, I'm not sure you could call that an addiction. Nicotine, though, definitely.
Well, so if you're a heavy coffee drinker and you don't have caffeine, you're going to get a wicked headache and you're going to be really cranky. That's a physiological response, right?
Yes, yes. Although that's not universal with caffeine. There are some ways of becoming emotionally or psychologically addicted, meaning that your level of emotional discomfort is so great that it induces a kind of emotional craving.
And do the professionals, such as yourself, make a distinction between an emotional addiction and a physiological addiction?
We do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
Well, a physiological addiction is something in your body is reacting to the sudden withdrawal of a chemical, and it creates strong physiological discomfort, and sometimes even to the point of sickness. Alcohol withdrawal, people have probably experienced that if they've ever had to try to recover from alcoholism. I don't know enough about withdrawal to talk about what the symptoms are with opioid withdrawal, but clearly other chemicals are needed to help moderate that in some cases. Emotional addiction, there's not actually something going wrong with your body. It just feels awful, and you feel scared, you feel sad, and you feel like you would feel a whole lot better if you just had some cannabis. Another way to think about addiction is the kinds of effects that it might have on other aspects of your life. So if you find that your professional life is being negatively affected, you're not doing your job well, you're consistently showing up late, you're losing focus, or if you're in school, your academic life similarly. If you find that your financial life is being negatively affected, you're spending way more money on cannabis than you can truly afford. If you find that your relationships are being affected by cannabis, either through not being able to connect to somebody at the level that they would like because you are impaired, could be through lying to them, could be through hiding it, so relationship damage might occur. And there are also health issues for some people. Again, I don't know the medical issues very well, but that much smoke can possibly be problematic for people with asthma or other underlying lung conditions.
So you've got a suite of potential ways to diagnose an addiction.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that's important because, particularly right now, people are still quarantined, they're hiding out, and so all those issues around being fuzzy, not being able to focus, not getting a lot of work done, could potentially be just because the given circumstances are challenging.
Yeah.
So there's value in having those other metrics.
Right. Well, I sort of come down to, if it's not a problem, it's not a problem.
Right.
If you're...
But I mean, the fuzziness could be just because it has nothing to do, I mean, like you might not be consuming cannabis at all, but if you're fuzzy and you're distracted and not doing your work very well, it might just be because you're scared, because you're anxious.
Yes, and I'm actually talking primarily about when you're under the influence of cannabis and whether that's causing issues. Yeah, it is. I don't know if I would be able to make the distinction between everyday stress or a general lack of focus and whether when you're not actually using, whether that's caused by continued use or not.
Right. So that's why it's valuable to ask, are you spending too much money? Are your relationships being affected? Those that you can have in person, again, because we're all isolated, there are a lot of potential factors that would go into someone feeling impaired potentially.
Yeah.
And so if you feel like, and again, clearly there's a distinction between alcohol addiction, opioid addiction. We've actually experienced this when my appendix exploded. They let me out of the hospital. I was on Dilaudid and Tramadol, which are opioid pain meds, and when I went off, I spent 2 solid weeks in withdrawal, and it was horrible. It was like having a cellular revolt happening in my body, and it was the worst flu you've ever experienced, and I just lay there in pain for 2 weeks because there was nothing else to do. And actually, I didn't have any guidance at this point, and so this is a key kind of interesting thing. We know that cannabis can help people get off opioid pain meds, but at the time we had no guidance. We didn't know what was going on, and so I just toughed it out because it was the one time in the last 4 years, and all of the medical stuff that I was dealing with, that cannabis didn't actually help. I didn't feel like I could keep enough THC in my system to offset the impact of going through withdrawal. Although I think, had I known, there are protocols for how you get off stuff, and I think I went off too fast. I had a lot of secondary and tertiary side effects that compelled me to want to get off as quickly as I possibly could. So there was a lot more going on. I think, though, that was a good lesson for us in knowing that you do need guidance when you're going through a situation like that. There are people who understand how to help taper off things, how to use cannabis to mitigate symptoms without having to just tough it out. But all that said, if someone feels like they are facing an addiction that's impacting their life, be it any substance, what are the best steps to begin addressing it? Because that's a scary realization, I'm sure, for a lot of folks.
Well, I just want to say one more thing about definition of addiction. You'll notice that I didn't mention frequency or amount of use.
Because we tend to think culturally as an addict of someone who's going after something all the time.
That's right. But we know plenty of people who have a cocktail or a beer every single day, maybe even 2 every single day. Are they addicted? Well, if we use the other criteria of whether it's negatively affecting them in a professional or personal or financial or physical way, no, it's just their way to calm down at the end of a day. And we all engage in self-soothing activities, whether it's a couple of drinks, or whether it's a cigarette, or whether it's going for a run, or whether it's masturbation, or whether video games, yoga, all of those things are ways. It's pretty hard to get through life without finding some sort of self-soothing behavior. A hot bath, chatting with a friend. And so the hierarchy of the harm that we assign to these self-soothing behaviors is in many ways cultural. And that somehow having a couple of drinks is fine, but if you're smoking cannabis every day, that's worse, because cannabis is the devil's weed, and just say no to drugs, and it's a drug that's bad, and alcohol's a drug that isn't, I guess. So amount of use isn't necessarily a good indicator of whether you're addicted. If you do think that you're addicted, well, again, when it comes to the physiological addictions like alcohol and opioids and other chemicals like that, you'll want to talk to an alcohol and drug counselor and to your primary care physician, because it will probably serve you to have medical intervention. With other types of addictions, like a cannabis addiction, if you find that you want to stop, having somebody to help, like a therapist, is a great idea. And one of the things that you're going to first take a look at is, what are you using the cannabis to address? And it's usually discomfort in your life, and that discomfort has become intolerable, and so you want to self-soothe, but you're doing it to such an extent that it's having negative impacts on other aspects of your life. And so one of the first things that the therapist will help you do is learn how to sit with discomfort and not use cannabis to make it go away. Because, the first question I'll say is, what's wrong with pain?
And people will say pain hurts.
And I'll say, yes, it does. But at the same time, it's not going to kill you. And can you learn to get, oddly enough, comfortable with pain?
Because it often feels like it's going to kill you.
It does.
It feels like the ground's going to open up and swallow you. It feels like there's just no possible way
that you can function
Yeah.
with feeling this much emotional pain, whether it's anxiety or sadness or dread or whatever it is. You just don't think that you can function. And so you learn to just pay attention to it, and you'll notice that sometimes if you do pay attention to it, that it actually fluctuates from day to day or even hour to hour, and you'll realize that actually you're not experiencing all this pain all the time that you have to make it go away. And you'll see the ebbs and flows, and once you start to understand it, it becomes a little bit easier to not run away from it.
Is there a way, we've talked about in mindfulness, of labeling thoughts, like, oh, that's an anxiety thought, or that's cogitating about the future. Can we treat pain in this, and what it does is it distances us a little bit. Can we distance ourselves from pain in the same way?
Emotional pain does often have a physical component to it. When you are anxious, you feel a knot in your stomach sometimes.
And we call it heartbreak because it hurts your heart.
It hurts your heart. When we're really sad, it can feel like it's hard to breathe, or that we've got this tightness here that feels like we're really close to crying all the time. And so the distancing in that case comes from breaking it down into its component parts. And it can be a little bit easier to say, okay, I'm having this physical feeling of tightness. That's the experience of anxiety. Interesting. Looking at the parts of it, as opposed to saying, oh my God, I'm so freaked out. Then you're in the territory of feeling like you are the experience, as opposed to watching it, looking at it, and being a little objective about it.
What do you do if you're in a place of being really revved up, anxious or angry or whatever it is, and you are in the sort of full flesh of that? It kind of takes you away from yourself. Often, people talk about when they're angry doing or saying things that they wouldn't ordinarily do. How do you get from there to here? Particularly if you're in the moment itself.
Not much you can do in the moment. If you can catch yourself, hopefully you can go to the old standby and take a few breaths. You can realize that you're about to do something unhelpful. But sometimes you can't.
Actually, let me back up.
Yeah.
Do you think people are ever really out of control? So they're not just giving themselves an excuse to do something untoward?
I think that sometimes our adrenaline kicks in so intensely that we will say and do things that we really don't want to. And it's not just it can take fairly subtle forms. I know that when I'm hungry, I am more of an asshole than I would like to be. Can I control that in the moment? Almost certainly not. It's a little bit dependent on the situation and who I'm with, and so those moments of being flared up, those are hard to address in the moment. So we have to do those, and that's why we meditate. That's why we practice mindfulness in the calmer times, so that we start to build in a muscle memory. We start to understand what the triggers are for that. We start to understand what the beliefs are that are feeding those kinds of behaviors, and start to mitigate those in our calmer times, so that they don't flare up as intensely in the high stress moments.
So you can be just as triggered in a moment, but at least cognizant of that fact. So you can step away, you can breathe, you can remove yourself from the situation until you can sort of regain some degree of homeostasis.
Right, but some of our triggers are actually going to come from unconscious beliefs. And if we uncover and counteract those unconscious beliefs, those aren't even going to show up, and the likelihood of us being triggered is less.
So, what's an example of an unconscious belief?
When somebody isn't paying attention to me, it means they hate me. And I freak out about that. In fact, when somebody isn't paying attention to me, all that means is that they aren't paying attention to me, and we may not be able to know the reason, and they might be distracted for something that has nothing to do with us. A lot of it has to do with stories that we tell ourselves that other people's behavior is all about us. Taking things personally. Other people's behavior is almost never about us.
That seems like a relief if you believe that, but a hard thing to actually grok, because it feels so personal.
Mm-hmm. And we have to, then it helps to remember that when other people are upset by our behavior often doesn't have to do with that other person, or certainly not how they are experiencing it. We are rarely intending to for them to have an angry reaction.
Right.
They are just experiencing it through their own lens.
And I just lost my train of thought. Well, I think we get into loops where we reinforce those narratives as well.
Yeah.
And so they seem even more real.
Yep.
Everybody hates me, I suck, I'm unlovable, whatever it might be. It feels like it's real.
Mm-hmm.
And then we engage in behaviors that actually reinforce what's going on. And so it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
Yeah. And again, when you're in it, and an emotional a moment of emotional activation, it's pretty hard to step out of it. And so that's why it's sort of like if you're playing a sport and you haven't practiced a jump shot in basketball, trying to do a really good jump shot in the middle of a game, not so easy. Get out of the pressure of the game and just practice your jump shot over and over and over again. Then the next time you go into the game, it's going to be a little bit easier.
So that's a great way of thinking about things like mindfulness and meditation, yoga, all those practices that we engage in. We get to do them in our off time.
Yes.
So that when game on time comes, we are more adept.
That's right. Yeah, it's pretty hard to be in the middle of being emotionally triggered and say, okay, I'm going to use my mindfulness now. It's sort of got to be built in. It's got to be, neurological muscle memory.
Right. One last question. Do you think, and this is a broader question, but do you think anybody is capable of change?
I think everybody's capable.
People you see character in our lives who we think of as somehow unredeemable in one way or another, and don't believe that it's possible for them to change. But do you think it's possible for everyone? Does everybody have that capacity?
Well, if I didn't, I don't think I'd be in this business. I don't think that my job would exist. But as the old joke goes, how many psychotherapists does it take to change a light bulb?
The light bulb has to want to change itself.
That's right. And so, is everybody capable of change? Yes. Is everybody interested in change? Not so much.
Yeah. So that's the challenge if we're running up against someone who we feel is engaging in a lot of problematic behavior. Mm-hmm. They could, but they have to want to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they may think that their behavior is working just fine. Even if they're in a lot of emotional pain most of the time, they might think, well, that's just normal. That's how life goes, and there isn't any other way to be. And one thing I haven't figured out is what tips the scale for people from deciding that from feeling that life is just fine as it is to deciding, oh, wait, actually there could be change and my life could actually be a little bit better.
And then that's just the first step, is a recognition of that. It's a multitudinous process.
Yeah.
All right. Mark Nash, thank you very much. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to email info@headyvermont.com. Mark's website, if you want to learn more about him, is
marknashvt.com.
All right. And it's gorgeous out, so we're going to get out there. You get out there. Oh, one last thing. If you're gardening for the first time and you have a lot of questions, High Mowing Seeds up in Hardwick not only has awesome seeds, but they have a really fantastic blog with a lot of great gardening tips. So let them be your resource. And have a lovely Monday. Thanks so much for joining us.